Welcome back to HOA Hell. I'm your host, Michael Kushner. With me today is Senior Associate at Encroachments, Sam Khil. Sam, how are you today?
Hello, Mike. Doing well. Thank you.
Today we have a very technical one. This is, as you know, episode 3 of our 6-part series on neighbor disputes. And today we're going to talk about trespass, encroachment, spite fences, and defending your dirt. So the real actual physical invasion of your property is kind of what we're going to cover today. Now, when we first planned this episode, it was going to be over an hour. We really had to pare things down because there's so much technical information here. So I want to say right off the bat that I could probably do 3 or 4 episodes alone just on the topics we're going to briefly cover in this episode today. And I might do that in the future. I might have another podcast down the line in a month or two just on easements, or just on adverse possession, or just on ejectment and quiet title. But for now, I'm giving an overview. That's the best we can do today in this kind of format. Yeah. So here's what we're going to cover today. I've got a little list here of things I want to discuss, and I don't want to forget any of them. We're going to talk about what trespass is, what counts as civil trespass. We're going to talk about the difference between trespass, encroachment, and ejectment. We're going to talk about what you do if a neighbor's grading, that is, they do some landscaping and they change elevation or they change the shape of their yard such that it changes the direction of the flow of water, okay, whether it's rain or from runoff from sprinklers and such. How to deal with spite fences and fences that invade your property, and how to bring a quiet title or ejectment claim and the things you got to do to prepare for that. That's going to kind of, in a nutshell, what we're going to cover today. So the first thing we should discuss is, what is trespass? Sam, what's trespass?
Well, Mike, in California, civil trespass constitutes any wrongful physical invasion of another's property.
Okay, it's a very simple definition. Yeah. Okay? It's the wrongful physical invasion of somebody else's property. Now, that would include, obviously, if I just decide I want to walk through your backyard and take a look around without your permission.
Absolutely.
That's trespass. I think that's trespass in the way that most people understand it.
Right.
But could it also be not so obvious?
Yeah, it's not limited to a person trespassing. It could be a drone. It could be any other physical object. It could be water. Okay, so if somebody is flying a drone over my yard, right, 15, 20 feet above and watching me, in addition to being a violation or invasion of privacy, which is a civil tort, right, and a nuisance, it could also be trespass because I have air rights to a certain extent, right? Absolutely.
And what else?
Water, like I said, could be another physical object, could be a fence, not to get ahead of ourselves. Yeah.
Somebody else is directing water onto your property. That water's trespassing. Or if I let my dog run through your yard, right, I'm responsible. The dog's not guilty of trespass. The neighbor is. Okay? So trespass, very simple definition. That's what we mean when we use that word. Okay? Now, I want to talk about harmful grading and intrusion. So thank you for that definition. So one of the ways in the example I just gave was this water intrusion or changing of grading. Let's say your neighbor does redoes their backyard, new landscaping, new hardscape, all this, and they get approved by the HOA. Okay, they get all the approvals we're supposed to have. They get the proper permits, but in doing their whatever improvements they made, the direction of water flowed in a different direction, okay, than it used to. And now, for example, water starts flowing from their yard into your yard, okay? And it's not the natural flow of the land, because remember, they changed the land itself. Right. Because if it was the natural flow of a natural piece of land, it's never a trespass. But if they've changed the grading from what it was to something new, and that redirects the flow of water, then that is a trespass. And that could cause a lot of damage. We see a lot of situations where people start getting leaks on their foundation or under the weep screed, and it starts to go into the living room. And we see that a lot. I know you've had a few cases in the recent past that have dealt with grading. Can you want to tell me briefly about one of them?
I did. I mean, I'll single out the one that's geared to go to mediation, and it's exactly that. It's a slightly elevated neighboring property. They alter the grading. They actually had HOA approval, which, by the way, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the HOA approves it or not. It's a matter of if you alter the grading, and that's a cause of the water flow wrongfully invading the abutting property. And that's exactly what's happening to my poor clients, nice couple in Riverside County. And all those issues and damages that you touched on, that's what they're experiencing.
Right. And it happens frequently, folks. So That's a form of trespass, and it's something that is actionable, and it's something that you have a right to seek damages for and to stop. Okay, that's important. Yeah. Now, let's talk about fences, walls, and encroachments. Okay, trespass and encroachment are very related. They're similar, but they are separate claims. We've told you what a trespass was. An encroachment is a wrongful permanent entry kind of onto your property, as opposed to a trespass, which is fleeting. Right? It comes in and out. It stops and starts, stops and starts. An encroachment would be, for example, I build a fence and I decide to, I'm not happy with the fence being along the property line or being on my side. I want to move it 2 inches. I want an extra 2 or 3 inches, and I just built the fence onto your property by 2 or 3 inches. That's encroachment. It's also trespass.
It is.
Because there could be permanent trespass, but it's encroachment. And if we were to file a lawsuit or make a demand, we would be doing it under 2 separate theories, trespass and encroachment. So any kind of structure, any kind of fence that encroaches, which is why it's called encroachment, onto your property, even a balcony that invades airspace over, somebody extends their balcony and now it's not on the ground on your space, but it's over your space. Yeah. That's still a trespass. It's still encroachment. And you are entitled, regardless of the cost, by the way, to have that removed. If for example, they were to build the wall there, and that wall was a $30,000 beautiful wall, and you guys found out it was actually on your property by 1 inch, move it. I don't care what it costs. It doesn't matter. The law's not going to look at the cost and go, that doesn't seem fair. It's too bad. If it's on your property, it's on your property. Unless it's subject to an easement or some adverse possession claim, we'll talk about that very briefly later. It doesn't matter what it costs. Get it off my property. Okay? And so it's a powerful legal tool to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Okay? And let's talk about, do you have anything you want to add on encroachments or
I believe you touched on this, but it doesn't matter how negligible an encroachment is. I mean, what we call in law de minimis.
Right.
I mean, you said 1 or 2 inches.
It could be 50 feet. It could be 1 inch.
It's an encroachment, yes.
Right. And by the way, there are different ways to resolve these. I've had cases where we resolved an encroachment by the other side buying our property. That 1 inch, for let's say the fence was down, 50 feet down that one side of the property line, they bought 1 inch for that 50 foot. They bought that. And that requires you to change the legal description of your property. And that's got to be recorded. And it's a whole big deal, but it can be done. And how you value that, there are methodologies and formulas for valuing that 1 inch over 50 feet.
Right.
But that is way, we've actually resolved cases that way by, instead of making them rip the fence out, they just, let me buy the 1 inch. We've done that, or we've had them rip the fence out. Or we've done it where we provide, an easement, but they have to pay for it.
Right.
Okay. So, it's like if you give the mobile companies, if they want to put a tower in your backyard and, they'll give you, a certain amount of money per month to do that, you can always rent out that inch. I mean,
utility easement, yeah.
That's pretty rare, but as a remedy, but it has been done. Right. Okay. What you don't want to do is just let it go and ignore it, and we'll tell you why in a few minutes. Okay. Now, of course, I guess the next kind of invasion or property invasion would be a spite fence.
Oh, yeah.
So we use the word spite fence, and that's kind of a misnomer because a spite fence implies it has to be a fence or a wall. No, it can be a fence, it can be a wall, it could be shrubs or trees that are planted in such a way as to provide a barrier. And there's actually a statute on this, okay? The reason it's called the spite fence statute is because it's specifically geared toward spite fences. So Civil Code 841.4 defines a spite fence, and it's a very simple definition. It's got to be 10 feet high or more, and it has to be placed there not for a legitimate security or property-related issue that's valid, but for a wrongful purpose, such as to interfere with your quiet enjoyment of your property or to interfere with your right to a protected view or whatever the case is. In other words, if it's planted legitimately to provide some security or as a sound dampening, device, then by definition, it won't be a spite fence. But if it's planted or placed there specifically for a wrongful purpose of interfering with your property or your rights, then it's considered a spite fence. Now, that's obviously much harder to prove. And again, it doesn't have to be a fence. Just call it that. It can be trees or shrubs that are growing and blocking your protected view. Because remember, a view is not protected in California unless there's a document that protects it, either an ordinance, a law, or something in the governing documents that gives people a certain, protection of a certain degree of quarter of view. And by the way, in Orange County in particular, a lot of places do have that, especially ones by the beach. Or if you're in LA in the Valley and you've got spectacular panoramic views of the entire San Fernando Valley, those are often protected under the governing documents. But unless you have that, there's no view protection. But that's what a spite fence is. And we've got a couple of those going right now.
We do.
Because it's a great way to try to dig it to the other side.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Is, all right, I'm going to put, I feel like I need a couple of little I want 3 pine trees here right now because I want to block your view of that, little slice of the ocean over there.
Right.
So I'm going to plant these trees. Yeah, no, you can't do that. Okay. It's a nuisance. It violates the statute. It's several causes of action in one. Do you have anything off the top of your head on a spite fence? Anything I haven't mentioned?
I mean, you covered it all. Just the one brief note is a lot of times people are clumsy and they will make statements. They'll send text messages. There's back and forth between neighbors being hostile. So anything that you can provide that can evidence
we'll get to that.
the wrongful underlying motive, that can be fantastic.
That's the thing. I said real briefly that these are a little harder to prove because what we have to prove when it comes to a spite fence is intent.
Right.
Because that's what matters. Remember, if it's for a proper purpose like sound dampening or security, then it's legitimate. But if it's for a bad intent to interfere, then it's a problem. Well, the best way to prove intent is use somebody's words. So when you're dealing with something that's difficult to prove, every piece of evidence counts. So, but we'll get into that at the very end when we talk about how to document what you want to document. And that's going to be part of that. Okay. So we've kind of covered pretty quickly. I think we've done a very good job of quickly covering trespass, ejectment, spite fence, that sort of thing. Let's talk about the hard stuff. What quiet title is, what adverse possession is, and what are easements. Okay? I want to cover easements and adverse possession first. Okay? Now, those are easy to define in simple terms, which I'll do, but they're difficult to understand for a layperson because they are so nuanced and there are so many different kinds of easements and there are so many specific elements that there's no way that unless you've been exposed to this in the past, you're going to have any understanding.
Yeah.
So I really need to take a very bird's eye view of, or provide a bird's eye view of what we're talking about here. And that's going to have to suffice. In the future, I will do a show where I maybe dedicate just to easements, okay? But in very simple terms, an easement is granting a use interest to somebody else, okay? If I have a possessory interest in some way in someone else's property, it's going to be by an easement. Now, easements there are many kinds, and I'll touch on the most popular in a minute. But easements are protected. The person that enjoys the easement, that's called, I'm hesitant to even give you the legal term, the dominant and servient tenements. I'm not going to say those again. That's what they're called. I won't use that term again. But the person that enjoys the easement never becomes an owner. Okay, there's no ownership of the piece of property. It is simply a right to use that piece. It's not the right to use the whole property. Somebody that has an easement through, let's say, a path through your yard, doesn't have a right to walk in your house. That's not unless the easement extends into your house, which I've never seen. Now, most people are familiar with easements when it comes to utility easements.
Right.
They might not even realize it, but there's a very good chance that one or more utility companies already has an easement through your property underground. You just don't know it. But if you looked at your title when you bought the property and you looked at the title report that the title insurance company provided or that your broker provided, you'll often see some easements listed. And they're utility easements, PG&E or Verizon or whoever, whatever utility happens to be in your area. And that easement gives whoever maintains whatever it is, the phone lines or the electric or the city water, whatever it is that happens to travel underneath your property or over your property if it's power lines. The easement gives their workers the right to come onto your property for the purpose of servicing whatever has to be serviced. But the easements will always expressly state the nature and scope of the easement. So you commonly see an easement on people that have beachside properties. Many of you might not know, but the ocean is public, and the beach is, at least from the water line, the high water line is public. And everything above that can be private. Okay, so a private club can own the beach in front of a specific, 1,000 yards to the left and right of a specific part of the beach, but only down to the high water mark, the high tide water mark. Mm-hmm. Anything below that is public. So if you're running in the waves and you can run all the way, you can run, where the Ritz-Carlton is, that might be their private beach up here, down by the water it isn't, okay? Well, there's also mandatory access from the streets to the beach that have to be required in order to get to the water line. And so sometimes the law actually forces you to provide easements. Hmm. And so you see a lot in a path easement, for example, through a corner of somebody's property where they have a 5-foot corridor that they can't prevent people from using. They can't put a fence up to block it because that would block the people enjoying the easement from using the easement. They can't exclude. Mm-hmm. So people have a right to walk there. Now, they can't go off that 5-foot strip because then they're trespassing. But they can use whatever that scope of the easement is, they can use that. And the owner of the property, the one that has to allow that use, can't interfere with the use. So there are 4 kinds of easements that we see in California a lot. Express easement, an easement by necessity, a prescriptive easement, and an implied easement. I'm not going to focus on what each of those are today, okay, except for one. And before I talk about prescriptive easement, because I'm going to come back to it, and you'll see why in a minute, I want to go into another type of easement-like issue, but it's different. Because remember when I said, with an easement, you never own the property. You just have the right to use somebody else's, a portion, right? This next legal doctrine actually allows people to seize ownership of part or all of somebody else's land. Now, that might scare a lot of people, and it should. But you'll be happy to hear that in California, it's very, very rare and difficult because of one of the requirements is almost never met. But where that requirement is met, and I'll give you one case where it is, somebody who owns a piece of property could find that later on in time, they don't own it anymore. And they had no idea how that happened. And that would be something called adverse possession. So I'm going to talk about adverse possession, and then I'm going to jump back to prescriptive easement, okay? Adverse possession, and I'm going to partially read from the code because I like to use their language, okay? Requires, so to adversely possess a part or all of somebody else's property, you have to meet all of the following elements. Number 1, you have to have done the things I'm about to talk about for 5 continuous years. Okay, so what are those things I'm about to talk about that you're supposed to be doing for 5 continuous years? You have to occupy that property in what's called a hostile and adverse way. And I'll tell you what that means in a moment. Your use of that property, your occupation has to be open and notorious. Okay? And you have to exercise at all times during that 5-year period exclusive control. So I'm going to talk about first what is hostile and what is adverse. Well, hostile and adverse basically means, let's say you have a piece of property that's 100 acres, and I'm on the next parcel over, and you've got 100 acres there, and there's like an acre that I like to use that you never go and see, you never visit it, right? So I decide to walk onto your property one day, and I build a fence. And I encapsulate half of one of your 100 acres. Mm-hmm. And I fence it off. That's hostile and adverse. Okay? I am claiming that piece as mine to the exclusion of others. Now, some of these are related. It's also exclusive control. Okay? But some of these are related. But I am basically seizing a piece of your property in a way that is not just, I'm going to use this, and as long as you don't call me out, I guess I'm okay because I'm not going to go to jail because I'm not, if you don't call me out and trespass me, then I'm not trespassing, so I'm okay. No, this is more than that. You're saying, you know what, this is mine. You might even put signs on there saying, do not trespass.
You're depriving the rightful owner of use, yeah.
Not of just the rightful owner, anybody.
Anybody. Yep.
Anybody else.
Yep.
You're saying, don't walk across this. For example, let's say in your 100 acres, you used to know that your neighbors used to walk across a part of that half acre that I'm going to take, right? And you always let them. You give them permission.
Yeah.
They say, hey, can we do that? It'll save us walking an extra 1,000 feet. You go, no problem, do it. When I put up my fence, I have now blocked the people that you gave permission to. And they're going to think, oh, he must just put the fence up. I guess we're not allowed to use it anymore. And they might not think anything of it. So that's what I mean by hostile. And that's what I mean by adverse. And then exclusive control is if I lock the gate or I don't provide you, the owner, with access to use that part of the property.
Yeah.
For example, let's say you don't know off the top of your head that that's actually part of your 100 acres. You assume when you walked your property, the next time you walked it, you see a new fence put up. You go, oh, we put up a new fence. That's nice. And it might not even occur to you that that's part of your property. Okay? But by excluding you, I've now shown exclusive control.
Right.
Okay? And I'm excluding everybody. All right? I'm holding myself out hostilely and adversely as the owner of that property. So let's take my fence example. I built the fence. I've excluded you. I've excluded everybody. I stopped your friends from using it that you would give them permission to. I got a lock on I might even have a no trespassing sign on the gate. I do it for 5 continuous years. I do all that. Have I adversely possessed the property? Do I now own it? Not in California unless I hit one more element.
Yeah.
And this is the one that kills 99.9% of all people. And that is you must have paid taxes. I have to prove that I paid the taxes on the portion of the land that I took. So for example, if your taxes are $12,000 a year and I adversely want to possess your whole property because let's say you live in Europe and you never come visit it, and I just take over your house and I pay the taxes for you. I actually pay them. I own that house after 5 years. Okay? That's very rare that happens. It's very rare. That paying the taxes thing is what kills people. Okay? But there are examples of when that does happen. And I'll give you an example. Let's say property lines were sloppily drawn and the city believes that the property line is where you believe the property line to be. And so for however many years, you guys have been paying taxes based on what the city has assessed whatever you bought the property, that was the assessment value. But let's say the property lines were wrong. And your neighbor or you have been paying the taxes all along because that's what the city thought. And it turns out you went and got a survey and it turns out property line is actually 3 inches elsewhere. I don't want to be too mean to our hypothetical person.
Right.
So it's 3 inches elsewhere. That person has a very strong adverse possession claim.
They do.
It wasn't with permission.
Right.
They'd excluded me. Okay, it was open and notorious. It was hostile. It was for 5 years and they paid the taxes.
Right.
Okay. Now, I've never seen a case like that, to be honest. I haven't seen that. I've never seen a successful adverse possession in California in my entire career. I know that they happen, but they're rare. But it does happen for the most part. It happens a little differently, and it happens through something called a prescriptive easement.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm going to travel back to the easements for a minute. A prescriptive easement, and it's the only type of the 4 easements that I'm going to describe in detail at this podcast. In the future, I might do more. A prescriptive easement is basically the same thing as adverse possession, except for 2 things. The tax obligation is gone, and at the end of the period, the 5 years, I don't own the property. The title is still held by the original owner, but I now have a right to use whatever portion I prescriptively took title to, or took advantage of, not title, took advantage of. So your half-acre situation, I build that fence. Okay? At the end of the 5-year period, I do not own that half acre because you've been paying the taxes on your 100 acres.
Right.
You didn't know it was 95 and a half acres that you were still using and that you were excluded from half an acre, but you were paying taxes on the 100. So I don't get an adverse, but I do get a prescriptive easement so that I can use that piece of property. Okay? Now, in using that piece of property, does that mean I can exclude you from using it? No. I cannot exclude you from using it. I can use it. You can't exclude me from using it. I have a right to use it. I can't put up a fence and block your use. But you can't put up a fence on your own property now and block my use. I have the right to use that. Okay? And because that easement isn't recorded, and it's not going to be the type that you can validly record, it does not run with the land.
Right.
Okay? But that's all I'm going to say today. A prescriptive easement, actually, it might run with the land. I'd have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head if it runs with the land. So forgive me for saying that. I could be wrong on that. I'm going to check that out. And I will put a note in the description with the answer to that question. Okay? So for those of you who are interested in whether or not a prescriptive easement runs with the land, look at the show notes or the description for the answer to that. Okay? We don't, even though I've been doing this for almost 30 years and I'm considered an expert in this field, I don't know everything. Sometimes things slip my mind.
Right. Well, it's an uncommon issue when you have a successor claimant potentially on whether it runs or not.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. But still, it's something I'm bothered because I know I knew it at some point. And now I'm going to turn to Sam and I'm going to say, Sam, I've got a trespass problem. I've got an ejectment problem. I've got a quiet title issue. And by the way, I didn't discuss quiet title. Quiet title is the cause of action that you would bring to have the court declare what our rights are to that piece of property. If somebody's claiming an ownership interest or claiming an easement interest in property, and I'm there's a fight. I'm disputing. We're disputing it. We don't agree. The method that you would resolve that is through a quiet title action. And to quiet title is to say, okay, everybody quiet down, quiet down. You guys are fighting about who owns what or who has what rights to this piece of property. Here's who has that.
Right.
The court quiets the argument and settles it. And then that gets recorded, and now you've cleaned up the record, the public record. That's all a quiet title is. So I have a trespass problem. I have an ejectment problem. I have a quiet title problem. I have a water intrusion problem because of a change in grading, or I have somebody declaring that they own my property somehow through adverse possession or through they have a right to use it through some easement. How do I protect myself so that if I need to fight this, I can fight this?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think a good place to start would be to get a professional surveyor out, do a survey. That's always a good place.
I think that's required, right?
That's required. That way you know exactly what rights you have, what the parameters are, and
it's the only way to get a property
right.
Land.
I'll add another one here. You can pull permits, although permits sometimes can be erroneous. They can include errors that were captured, so it may require a title curative element. But in order to do that effectively, you need that survey. So a professional survey.
And then the permits.
The other good thing to do, as advisable, is to take date and timestamp photos and perhaps recordings. That way you have captured, different stages of a potential trespass, the before, after, or any changes and
let me interrupt you then. On that level,
activities.
When we talked about the grading on the water.
Right.
Okay. Let's say you noticed that on June 1st, your neighbor completed this, huge month-long project of redoing their whole yard.
Yeah.
And they brought you back there. Look how great our pool looks. Look at the new yard. It's beautiful, right? Okay, so that occurred on June 1st. And then it rains on June 10th. And all of a sudden, water comes pouring into your, in a way that's never done that before.
Yeah.
And so you note that, okay? And then it happened again and again and again. Or every time he waters. And now okay, that never used to happen, but June 1st occurred. Now it happens.
Capture that pattern. And
Capture
like you said before, these things can be fleeting, right? These trespasses are fleeting. They're not necessarily permanent. So capture that.
They can have permanent damage.
They can have permanent damage. So capture that the best you can, whether it's, still shot, timestamp, date stamped photos, video recordings perhaps even. That may not be a bad thing. You can possibly fly up a drone, capture some good images, and then note and log any patterns. If you notice a pattern, a time of a day, right, or on weekends, or whatever it may be,
every time he waters,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be very essential to proving up or defending your side of the argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think a last one might be, and we've said this before, so we'll say it again, and we'll probably keep saying it, is look at your governing documents.
And HOAs, absolutely.
Yeah. Look at your governing documents because that grading might have been a violation of the governing documents. And now you get to bring in your HOA. If what's happened is qualifies as a nuisance or a violation, you can bring your HOA anyway, but this is just one more way. So look at your governing documents and see if it constitutes a violation or whether it's the nuisance or they've gone beyond the scope of whatever their plans were, permitted plans. Yeah. Whatever it is, you want to have your ammo in front before you take action. But if any kind of property line dispute that occurs, any kind of dispute that occurs on your property line, those are always going to be somewhat complicated. They're always going to be somewhat emotional because somebody's invading your space that you paid for and it's yours. It's your privacy. So those are complicated, they're nuanced, and you've got to protect your rights in order to secure your rights. And that's when it's something like that and talking to them doesn't work, that's when you want to call us at MBK Chapman. And we'll step in and we can help you sort that out. We do that all the time. So closing thought, whether it's a fence built 6 inches onto your property, or you have water intrusion as a result of regrading, or you have a spite fence blocking a protected view, you don't have to take that. You have a right to enjoy your property, and you have a right to prevent other people from wrongfully interfering with the use and enjoyment of your property, and to prevent them from causing any kind of destruction to your property. And part of using your property is using your whole property. So if somebody is invading a systemic inch of your property, then you've been denied that inch. And that matters to a lot of people. It matters to me. It's my property.
It's offensive to a lot of people.
It's very offensive.
Yeah.
So act. And you act by following kind of the steps we talked about today. Give us a call at MBK Chapman. We can help you with that. Next time, in episode 4 of our 6-part series, where we go through, or we've been detailing neighbor disputes, we're going to talk about what happens when your HOA is the problem. So, as a quick example to that, I've already done a brief podcast on HOA loving to sit back and wash its hands when somebody has violated the governing documents and is interfering with your rights to your property. And they go, well, this is between you and your neighbor. That's a violation. We've talked about that. Well, that's them making the problem worse. It's them not doing their job. So we're going to go into detail about what happens when the HOA is the problem. They're the ones that are making things worse, not better. Okay? When it comes to neighbor disputes. I'm Michael Kushner, and this has been HOA Hell. I want to thank Sam for being here today, and we look forward to having you next time. If you like this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe if you're not already subscribed to our channel, HOA Hell. If you want to leave a comment, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or you want to have one of your stories featured on our show, please leave a comment. And until next time, have a wonderful day.